Chapter 23 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 23. Will Fortune Never Come with Both Hands Full? Baffled where he had expected to succeed, Alexis Secretan is at a loss what to do next. No doubt of Jenny's truthfulness presents itself to his mind. Youthful candour beamed in that open countenance of hers. How could he imagine the craft of the serpent in a child who seemed simple as the sucking dove? What is he to do? Go to Jersey and hunt for Mrs. Yokohama Gray on the chance of finding Sybil still with that lady, despite Jenny's assertion of her sister's fickleness. This seemed the most obvious course for him to take, and he loses no time in taking it. The journey from Redcastle in Yorkshire to the Channel Islands is a long one, and it is only on the third day after his interview with Jane Faunthorpe that Alexis finds himself in St. Heliers. Vain are his inquiries for Mrs. Yokohama Gray, or for any Mrs. Gray with a name approaching Yokohama in sound. He finds a Mrs. Gray, pure and simple, but she is a laundress, and certainly not in a position to afford the luxury of a governess for her children. Alexis pursues his inquiry in every quarter likely to afford information. He sees postmasters, lodging-house keepers, librarians, and tries to obtain tidings of any lady with a pretty governess residing in the island. Sybil might be remembered for her pretty face, he thinks, where her name was unknown or forgotten. All his efforts are vain. He starts upon various false scents, wastes a great deal of time and trouble, and leaves the island at last thoroughly dispirited. What more is there for him to do? Nothing, assuredly, unless he can extort the secret of his wife's whereabouts from that inflexible young woman, Jane Dimond. It seems such a hard thing to have Sybil's letter in his pocket, to know that she is within a day's post, and yet not be able to find her. At Southampton, while he is loitering about waiting for the train that is to take him back to London, he remembers that he has, or ought to have, a kinswoman living in the neighbourhood of Winchester. A maiden lady, his father's first cousin, has lived all her life on a small estate near that cathedral city. He remembers spending a month at Cheswold Grange with his father and mother during one of those rare visits which they made to their native country. He was a child at this time, and it had struck him since that his father must have had some stronger motive than family affection in coming over to England to visit a quiet maiden lady living in an out-of-the-way village. His father had possibly some idea of securing Miss Secretan's fortune for himself or his boy. Philip Secretan was assuredly the last of men to degrade himself by courting a wealthy relative, but he may have thought it his duty to his boy to keep on friendly terms with the owner of the only estate remaining to the family. As years went on, Mr. Secretan had grown more indolent in his habits, and less inclined to cross the Channel. But one of his farewell injunctions to Alexis, when the young man last visited him, had reference to Matilda Secretan. "Go and spend a few days with your cousin Matilda, now and then, Alex," said the father. "She was very fond of you when you were a little boy, and I know she'll be pleased to see you now you've grown into a fine young man. It's a quiet, out-of-the-way place for you to visit, but you will be made much of by the old lady, and I dare say you can get a little shooting there in October. Lord Starborough's preserves are close by, and your cousin is always on good terms with her neighbours." Alexis promised most dutifully, and was always intending to perform. But the visit to Miss Secretan was a business so easy to accomplish that it was deferred indefinitely. Alexis thought it would be a pity to go earlier than October, on account of Lord Starborough's pheasants, and 3 Octobers came and went without his finding leisure for the visit. Then came the sale of his commission, and he felt he should hardly like to face his cousin Matilda under such awkward circumstances. He would have to explain things, and he hated explanations. Next came his entanglement in Cupid's fatal net, and he had not a spare thought for Miss Secretan. Then followed his marriage and rapid descent in the social scale. He had sore need of a friend in those days, but as he had neglected his cousin Matilda in his brief day of prosperity, he could not approach her in his destitution. He might stoop to ask a favour of his Aunt Gorsuch, at whose house he had been a familiar guest, but he could not beg of Miss Secretan, to whom he was a stranger. He had a faint recollection of her as an old lady with silvery hair in corkscrew curls, a high nose, delicate peach-bloom cheeks, a slim straight figure, and a dress of rich black silk, like a clergyman's presentation gown. That she had been very kind to him, and that his life had been made particularly pleasant to him at Cheswold Grange, he could remember distinctly. He remembered telling Sibyl about his rich maiden cousin as they sat by the fire in Dixon Street one November evening, building castles in a brief interval of hopefulness. He had described that childish visit to Cheswold, and his girl wife had been fascinated by his picture of the pretty English country house and gardens, the meadows and the trout stream in which he had made his juvenile attempts at fly fishing. "Why shouldn't your cousin leave you her estate, Alex?" Sibyl had said eagerly. "Wouldn't that be a happy thing?" "A very happy thing, love, but not a likely turn of the wheel by any means," he had answered. "I have not seen my cousin since I was 10 years old. Whatever chances I had in that direction have been forfeited by my neglect." "Upon my word, Alexis, you seem to have delighted in throwing away fortune," Sibyl had answered, with a touch of anger. And after that she had given way to low spirits for the rest of the evening, and had talked of Cheswold Grange as a property that must have come to her husband if he had not wilfully flung away his prospect of inheritance. To-day, Alexis, sorely perplexed which way to turn in the maze of life, is inclined to dwell upon the memory of his boyish pleasures at Cheswold. He is so near the quiet old place, within 20 miles at most. Why should he not go and see Matilda Secretan? He can approach her without degradation now that he is a prosperous, money-earning man. He has no thought of that possible inheritance. It is not in his nature to calculate upon a thing of that kind. But being so utterly alone in the world just now, he feels it would do him good to grasp the hand of a relative, to receive kindness and sympathy from one who had known his father and mother. The train that was to have carried him to London conveys him to Winchester. At the station he is told that Cheswold is 3 miles from the city, so he determines to walk the distance. It is between 4 and 5 in the afternoon when he turns out of the High Street into the quiet country road which is to take him to Cheswold. Light showers have refreshed the verdure, the low water meadows are looking their greenest, and the grassy hills yonder shut out the world beyond this fertile valley, and give a look of security and repose to the landscape, so simply rustic, so thoroughly English in its character. An hour later, and Alexis stands at the entrance to the village churchyard, a turnstile at the corner of the wall. He remembers this very path across the churchyard as a short-cut to the Grange, and after nearly 20 years' absence the scene comes back to his memory as vividly as if he had left the place but yesterday. Yes, there stands the old yew-tree, whose widely stretching boughs rustle and creak against the window by the pulpit in boisterous weather. No busy work of restoration is going on here. The greenish glass of the old diamond-paned casements has not been exchanged for the brilliant colouring of the modern glass painter. The rough-cast walls are unchanged. There is the wooden dial that used to mark the flight of time when he was a boy. There stands the old family tomb, neglected, forgotten, under its ivy shroud. He lingers by the gate for some few minutes in a contemplative mood, looking dreamily at the well-remembered picture. Then he turns the stile and goes in. He crosses the churchyard, looking idly at the tombstones on either side of the path, and within a few paces of the lych gate he is brought to a standstill by a tablet that tells him his visit to his cousin has been deferred too long. A massive granite slab, surmounted by a cross in white marble, bears this inscription: In memory of Matilda, only daughter and heiress of Mark Horatio Secretan, who died at Cheswold Grange, August 14th, 1860, aged 82 years. Matilda Secretan had been dead exactly a year, and the friendly grasp of a kindred hand which Alexis has hoped for is not for him. Poor old lady, he sighs. Well, she has lived her life, and a good long one. An easy, harmless, passionless existence, full of creature comforts and village dignity. She was a great person in Cheswold. Perhaps it is wiser to play at greatness in a rural village than to struggle to be really great amidst the press of men. Pleasant to be born and die on one's own estate, to lie in one's shroud in the same room in which one was rocked in one's cradle, to look out with our dying eyes upon the green fields in which we learn to walk, our own fields, not gained by toil or greed, or overreaching our fellow men, but coming to us naturally as the blossoms come to the apple trees in our orchard. Yes, it must be a peaceful, pleasant life, affording no opportunity for sin. Satan must have had a bad time among small landed proprietors. Poor cousin Matilda. I wonder who has come in for her property. The Grange lies within 10 minutes' walk, just on the outer edge of the village. Alexis crosses the green with its duck pond, its groups of ancient elms before the good old village inn, with the rising sun, looking very much like a careful representation of a mustard plaster, swinging from the signpost. A low white house, this village inn, with a sloping thatch and a wonderful display of intensely red geraniums in intensely red flower pots. A perfect blaze of scarlet floriculture. Beyond the green and the rising sun, the road is shaded by fine old timber, and has a secluded look, as if one had strayed unawares into a gentleman's park. The hedgerows are so neatly cut, the grass margin of the road looks as if it had been mowed and rolled. There is a pleasant odour of pine woods. A little further on there comes an opening in the wooded screen, and across a running brook Alexis sees the wide park-like meadow which lies in front of Cheswold Grange. A sunk fence divides the grassland from the old-fashioned Grange garden, and to the left of the long, low old house, with its many gables, its dovecotes and bell turret, lies the orchard, whose treasures are guarded by a thick holly hedge of 2 centuries' growth. How well Alexis remembers the house, a hospitable dwelling in the days of his boyhood, but somewhat gloomy of aspect now. Everything has a neglected air. He can see that even at a distance. I suppose Miss Secretan's heir despises the old place, he thinks, and suffers the Grange to go to ruin while he squanders the revenue of the land in London. I wonder who the fellow is. Some low church parson, perhaps, or smooth-tongued doctor who got to the blind side of cousin Matilda at the last. He is at the lodge gate by this time. Even the lodge has a decayed air, a broken pane conspicuous in the parlour window, paint blistered, a bit of rotten gutter hanging from an angle of the roof. It looks like an Irish squireens' place in the bad old times 50 years ago, thinks Alexis. The lodge-keeper's wife is spreading out the weekly wash on the sunward side of a quickset hedge, and to this busy housewife Alexis addresses himself. "You've a pretty place here," he begins, with the casual air of an uninterested stranger. "Pity it shouldn't be kept up a little better." "Ah, it is a pity. answered the woman, shaking her head over the family linen. "Things were very different in Miss Secretan's time." She says this with the conviction that every one upon earth, the wandering stranger included, must know all about Miss Secretan. They may not have had the honour of that lady's acquaintance, but she must be known to them by reputation as one of the magnates of the land, just as Disraeli and Gladstone are known. "She was a good mistress?" hazarded Alexis. "Ah," sighs the woman, seeming to wring her hands as she wrings out a garment before unfurling it on the hedge. "Few like her. I won't say but what she was near. A lady that wouldn't allow the waste of a candle end, and wore a dress from year's end to year's end, but a silk as might stand alone. And them as is nearest towards themselves is ofttimes kindest to others. Miss Secretan was a kind friend to many. She could do more kindness with sixpence than some people can do with half a crown. And she left a very pretty property. A pity it should go into Chancery." "Is it in Chancery?" asked Alexis, warmly interested. "Well, I can't say as it is exactly, but it's something that way, I believe. You see, Miss Secretan, she makes her will a good 20 year ago, and she leaves all her property to a favourite nephew, or cousin, I'm not certain which, in trust for him if she should die before he came of age. But he was to have it handed over to him clear of everythink, if he was past 21. And she never altered that will. She had thoughts of altering it, I've heard Mrs. Bodlow, the housekeeper, say, because of her nephew not paying her the attention she expected. But once having given a good bit of trouble to make her will, she didn't care about beginning all over again. 'I'll wait,' says she, as I had it from Mrs. Bodlow. And I dare say, she says, as one of these odd days, says she, he'll remember me, she says, and come and see me, says she. And if not, says she, I'm hale and hearty still, she says, and there's time enough to alter my will, says she." Which Mrs. Bodlow repeated to me, word batum, while she was lying a corpse in that room with the 3 windows, as you may see from here. Alexis has turned from red to pale, and pale to red again, during the progress of this prolix relation. The lodge-keeper's wife only pauses for breath ere she pursues her argument. "So the will was let stand," she resumes, "and Miss Secretan didn't so much as trouble herself to find out whether the young man was living or dead. And lo and behold, when the will was made known, the heir was nowheres to be found. I believe the lawyers and such like did all as was proper, and he was advertised to his advantage in the newspapers continual. But he never answered none of the advertisements, which he couldn't have failed to do if he was alive and could write, unless he'd gone out to horse-trailer and turned butcher like that simple-hearted young gentleman as you read of in the newspapers. Howsomever, there's the property, belonging to no one, as you may say, and things going to ruin. There's one gardener kept to grub about a bit, where there used to be 2 men and a bye, at work constant. And there's a poor 'elpless old woman in the 'ouse, with 'ardly strength to open a shutter and let in a breath of air. So you may guess as the moths are having their free will of the damask curtains and such like." "You didn't hear the name of the heir?" says Alexis interrogatively. "Not his christened name. His other name was the same as hern. I'll have a Secretan to come after me if I can," she says. And Mrs. Bodlow told me as she believed it was mostly on account of the name as Miss Secretan left that young man the property. Alexis tries his hardest to still the troubled beating of his heart, tries to persuade himself that it is too soon to feel the flush and pride of sudden unexpected fortune. Matilda Secretan may have had other cousins or nephews, he tells himself. He is not particularly well posted in the family history, having heard his father prose about his kindred with youth's heedless ear. He tells himself it is too soon to be glad, yet he feels as if he were lord of the soil. He stands within the gate, and he plants his foot firmly on the ground. I wonder if I am standing on my own land, he thinks. I feel as if there were a glow in the soil that communicates itself to my blood. It is the land that has belonged to my race for 300 years. The fact that for the space of a year no one has come forward to claim the property encourages the supposition that he himself is the missing heir. "Would it be possible for me to see the house?" he inquires, seized with a feverish desire to examine the mansion which may or may not be his. "I dare say if you was to offer the old lady a trifle, she wouldn't mind letting you in to see it, sir. She's a little hard of hearing." "Suppose I offer you 5 shillings to begin with," suggests Alexis, dropping 2 half-crowns into the matron's hand. "You might take me up to the house and make things square with the old lady." The lodge-keeper's face beams all over with delight. "I'm sure I'm much beholden to you, sir. I'll dry my hands directly minute, and step up to the great house with you." The Grange has been the great house at Cheswold for generations. "Oh, Sibyl," thinks Alexis, as he walks along the grassy path under the elms, "if you had only waited for brighter days, how happy we might have been. You abandoned me in order to seek fortune, and you don't seem to have won it yet. Fortune falls into my lap unsought." The fact of his wife's desertion seems harder to him in the face of this sudden turn of Fortune's wheel than it has seemed before. That prosperity should come to him thus, and find him a lonely man. If this estate of Cheswold has been actually left him, shall he lure his wife back to him by a golden bait? Shall he win from his altered fortunes the boon that has been refused to a husband's entreaty? No, 1,000 times no. If she comes back to me ever, she shall return to the pauper she abandoned, he tells himself. She shall come back for love of me, her husband, and not to be mistress of Cheswold Grange. Yet how proud he would be, having won her back to her duty, to point to this peaceful old English home and say, "I am no longer an adventurer and a beggar. All this is ours, and our children's after us." He has quite made up his mind by this time that he is the missing heir, and that these elms which screen him from the low western sun are his very own. Cheswold Grange upon this August evening has a mouldy smell, and wears the gloomy and somewhat ghostly aspect of a house whose shutters are for the most part closed against air and sunshine. But it is a good old house, notwithstanding. The rooms are large, the staircase is wide and substantial, with fine carved oak balusters, an open gallery above with numerous doors, suggestive of ample accommodation for a family. The quaint old furniture remains just as Miss Secretan left it. Chairs and sofas are carefully shrouded in holland, and the dust lies thick upon the old rosewood tables, the Canton porcelain, and the crystal chandeliers, whose half-burned wax candles shed their light upon the vanished mistress of the Grange. "Nothing has been touched," says Mrs. Cramp of the lodge, as she follows Alexis and the old woman in charge from room to room. "Everythink is the same as in Miss Secretan's time, except that when she was living you couldn't have found a grain of dust in the place if you'd offered a £5 note for it." After having looked at the house, Alexis explores the stables and gardens. It is dark by the time his inspection is finished, and he makes up his mind to spend the night at the Rising Sun in Cheswold village. He feels attached to the place already. "Is there much land belonging to the Grange?" he inquires of Mrs. Cramp, the old woman in charge being little more than a dummy, and Mrs. Cramp serving as interpreter. "I can't say how many acres, sir, though I dare say my husband might know if he was home. There's Baker's farm, and there's the Hollow farm, and the Hill farm. That must be a good bit altogether. Miss Secretan was a lady of the manor." This is pleasant to hear. Alexis gratifies the deaf caretaker with his bounty, and goes back to the gate with Mrs. Cramp, who enlarges upon the beauties of the place, and ask him if he has any idea of taking the property if it should be to let. "Chancery might just as well let the great house, you see, sir, if it is only for the sake of having it took care of. It would be all the better for the heir if he should come to claim his own. It went to my heart to see things so dusty. And I hope, sir, if you should have any thoughts of the place, you'll keep on me and my good man at the lodge. We served Miss Secretan faithful above 11 years. I won't displace you, Mrs. Cramp, you may rely on it, if I should ever come to be master of Cheswold Grange. Good night. Oh, by the way," he adds, just as he is turning to go, "do you happen to know the name of Miss Secretan's lawyer?" "Mr. Scrodgers of Winchester, sir. Scrodgers and Son it is now." "Thanks. Good night again." "He must be thinking of taking the place," muses Mrs. Cramp, "or he wouldn't want to see Mr. Scrodgers." Alexis finds the Rising Sun a comfortable old hostelry of a primitive style. Dinner resolves itself into tea and eggs and bacon. But the eggs and bacon are admirable, the home-made loaf delicious, and the cream jug which accompanies the teapot suggests a land flowing with milk and honey. The parlour in which the traveller enjoys this homely meal is clean and bright, and adjoins the bar so closely that Alexis can carry on a conversation with the landlord as he takes his refreshment. From this gentleman he hears that Cheswold Grange is one of the nicest little estates in the county, worth 1,500 a year at the lowest computation, and that Miss Secretan was a careful old lady and must have saved money. "How could she spend much, you see, sir, living in her quiet way, never leaving home from year's end to year's end, growing her own meat and making her own butter, and having everything in a ring fence, as you may say." "Ah, there'll be a pretty bit of rhino for that young man to come into if they ever find him." That young man, or the young man who supposes himself to be the heir, feels a thrill of satisfaction at the idea, and is somewhat impatient for to-morrow morning and an interview with Messrs. Scrodgers and Son. "Do you know much about Mr. Scrodgers of Winchester, the old lady's solicitor?" asks Alexis. "Not much, sir, I'm happy to say. I keeps aloof from that cattle. Not as I've ever heard any harm of Scrodgers and Son, but they're all tarred with the same brush to my mind. If you've got a bit of freehold property, they want you to mortgage it just to give them something to do. If you've got a bit of property to leave, they want you to throw it into hodgepodge just to give them the handling of it. And if they can get you into Chancery body and bones, they do it for the good of trade. No lawyers for me, sir. But I believe, as lawyers go, Scrodgers and Son are very decent fellows." Alexis sleeps peacefully that night, better than he has slept since he landed in the port of London, and is closeted with Mr. Scrodgers the elder early next morning in the quiet front parlour of a substantial old house in a side street in Winchester. The office has a respectable and well-to-do look, and Mr. Scrodgers is white-bearded and venerable enough for an abbot. The grave cathedral overshadows his dwelling, and increases the respectability of his surroundings. Alexis has sent in his card. Alexis Secretan, agent for Messrs. Keel and Screw, Sydney. The lawyer receives him politely, with a manner that is half friendly, half suspicious. "May I ask what Mr. Secretan I have the pleasure of addressing?" he inquires, looking at the card. "I don't quite know how you would wish me to describe myself. I am the son of Philip Secretan, who died at Nice in 1858, and who was first cousin of Miss Secretan of Cheswold Grange. I come to you, Mr. Scrodgers, to inquire about my cousin's will. I have been in Australia for the last 2 years, acting as agent for a house in the city, and I only became aware of my cousin Matilda's death yesterday evening." "This is very serious," says Mr. Scrodgers, looking at Alexis as if he should like to convict him as an impostor. "And pray, how did you come to hear of Miss Secretan's demise yesterday evening, not having heard of it prior to that time. May I ask how the intelligence reached you finally?" Mr. Scrodgers rubs his hands complacently after this address, and fixes Alexis with his large grey eyes, which are of the protuberant order. "The knowledge came to me in the simplest possible manner. I went over to Cheswold, intending to pay my cousin a visit, and found her name on a tombstone in the churchyard." "Are you quite sure, sir, that the fact of Miss Secretan's death did not become known to you in Australia, and did not influence your return to this country?" inquires the lawyer severely. "If you think me an impostor, Mr. Scrodgers, I will thank you to say so plainly, and I will take means to establish my identity. This beating about the bush is as insulting to my understanding as it is to my honour." "This is a very serious business, Mr. Secretan, a good deal more serious than you may suppose. We are entrusted with a great responsibility, sir. If we err, it must be on the side of caution." "You mean that my cousin Matilda left the whole of her property to Alexis Secretan, and you doubt whether I am the man, although I put his name upon my card." "It would be for you to establish your identity, Mr. Secretan." "Nothing more easy. My father's solicitors, Messrs. Gull and Sharp of Lincoln's Inn Fields, have been familiar with every stage of my existence up to the time when I sold my commission about 5 years ago. They hold all family documents, certificates of baptism, and so on. My father was a careless man as to business matters, but he had infinite faith in his lawyers, and he committed all papers of any significance to their charge. Messrs. Gull and Sharp are a most respectable firm," answers Mr. Scrodgers, with a reverential expression of countenance, as if so old established a firm ought to be spoken of with awe. "I refer you to them for my identification," says Alexis, "and I shall be obliged if you will let them have a copy of my cousin's will. I shall go to them directly I get back to London, and take all necessary steps under their advice. I have not offended you, I hope, Mr. Secretan, by my business-like manner of discussing this question. I had the honour to enjoy Miss Secretan's confidence for many years, and I am naturally, very naturally, quite proper. Good morning, Mr. Scrodgers. Please lose no time about the copy of my cousin's will. The original document is in Doctors' Commons. Ah, then, Gull and Sharp shall be able to get me a copy. Good morning." Alexis leaves the dull old office elate. He knows all that he wanted to know, knows that he is lord of Cheswold Grange, that he need never go back to Australia, that his agency for Keel and Screw is at an end, that he is an Englishman of landed estate, a gentleman by fortune as he is a gentleman by birth. He is eager to get to London, if it were only to communicate his good fortune to the friend of his adversity, Richard Plowden. Dear old Dick! How glad he will be! He shall have an acre of ferns at Cheswold, and his mother need never let lodgings any more unless she likes. There is one thought that touches him most deeply, the thought of the child whose face he has never seen. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Dead Men's Shoes. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Herndon Bell. Dead Men's Shoes by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 24. Startling Information. Aided by Messrs. Gull and Sharp of the Fields, who put all things in train for him and take him under their parchment wing with affectionate protection, Alexis has no difficulty in proving his right to Cheswold Grange, and all those messuages and tenements and various holdings thereto appertaining. It is a comfortable estate to inherit, for Miss Secretan has been an admirable woman of business, and has managed everything with fostering care, which has beautified and enriched all it touched. The land, save 35 acres of home farm, park-like pasturage all of it, is let on long leases to tenants who are contented with their holdings, and do not grudge labour or money on improvements. The gardens, the house, the stables, need only a little care to restore them to that perfection of elegant precision and graceful order which distinguished them during Miss Secretan's lifetime. Alexis takes a singular mode of restoring things, and one which wins him much favour from the inhabitants of Cheswold and its immediate neighbourhood. He contrives, with considerable trouble to himself, to get back all his cousin's old servants, the butler, or indoor servant, pompous as the ruler over a retinue of powdered footmen, yet with only one small underling in the shape of a knife-boy. Mrs. Bodlow, the cook and housekeeper, who had served Miss Secretan 25 years. The middle-aged housemaid, who had polished every article of furniture in the low-ceilinged bedchambers so often that each had become an object of affection and pride to her. The gardeners, who knew every apple tree, every plum and peach, nectarine and apricot on the red walls. The coachman, who had driven Miss Secretan about in the old-fashioned barouche, a serviceable vehicle yet, and in the old green pony chaise, and had ultimately subsided into drawing her along the shady lanes in a Bath chair. Alexis feels a pride in restoring the scattered household, in seeing every bit of furniture, every quaint old ornament assume its proper place. How intensely had Matilda Secretan studied the fitness of things before she so placed them, the Chelsea shepherdess at this angle, the Wedgwood teapot on that shelf, the figure of Quin as Falstaff in Bow china to balance Kitty Clive in Worcester ware, and so on to the end of the modest collection. Alexis remembers how his childish eyes had gloated on the old china, how those household treasures had seemed to him more beautiful than anything he had ever seen before. He remembers the garden, the broad gravel walk leading to a Dutch summer-house in red brick, with stained glass windows, the orange trees in square green tubs ranged along the closely shorn grass that had once served as a bowling green. The place is very dear to him, for it recalls the happiest days of his childhood. Before the elms in the avenue have quite lost their summer green in the early days of a fine September, Alexis is established at the Grange. The old servants have come back, and everything is in order. Full of delight in his new possessions, the master of Cheswold Grange invites Richard Plowden to come and shoot his partridges. "They are my partridges," he adds, "though they feed on the tenants' corn for the most part. Come and have a pop at them, Dick." An invitation which startles Mr. Plowden, who has never fired a gun in his life. Dick comes to Cheswold Grange, however, and gladly, not to pop at the partridges, but to rejoice in the sight of his old friend and patron basking in prosperity's sunshine. "I always felt you must be born to good luck, Captain Secretan. Call me Alex, Dick, or I shall hit you." "Well, then, Alex, there was something so bright and genial about you. It seemed as if you couldn't long be under a cloud." "Did it, Dick? The cloudy weather lasted quite long enough, though, old fellow, and the clouds are not gone yet. It's a hard thing to have this beautiful place, and not be able to bring my baby boy here and establish him in the home which is to be his when I am dead and gone." "Have you told your wife of your altered fortunes?" inquires Dick. "Not a word. She shall know me only as the pauper she deserted, or I will at best own to the wages of a hard-working clerk. She shall come back to my poverty, Dick, if she and I are ever to be reunited. Not to my wealth. How pretty she would look at the head of this table, by the way." They are lounging over their wine after dinner, the diamond-cut decanters reflected in the polished mahogany as in dark water, golden egg-plums from the western wall, and peaches from the southern, nesting among dark green leaves in heart-shaped dishes of old Derby china. "Yes, I dare say," says Dick, more inclined to blame than to praise the absent wife. "You never saw her, Dick. A pity. She is so lovely. A woman created for happiness and prosperity, not for toil and care. And in marrying me she wedded poverty and sorrow. It was very hard for her. I ought to have been more considerate. Can I wonder that she grew weary of the struggle, that she tried to cut the knot that bound her to my misfortunes? Poor child! Poor you, I think, to have wedded such a piece of selfish prettiness," says Dick. "Don't be hard on her, Dick. Fortune was too unkind in those days. The outlook was so black. If there had been a glimmer of hope on our horizon, she would have stayed with me, I've no doubt. Think of her now, drudging as a governess, hiding her beauty in some back parlour or second-floor nursery, toiling for a pittance, while I enjoy all the comforts of this dear old place. That's hard to think of, isn't it, old fellow?" "Merely retributive justice," answers Dick sturdily. "But are you sure that she is a governess now?" "I have every reason to suppose so. Her last letter tells me that she is on the high road to fortune which she and I are to share. Taking this in conjunction with the information I got from her sister, I can only imagine that she is in the employment of some very rich person likely to leave her money." "Rather an ignoble position that," says Dick, "waiting for dead men's shoes." Alexis sighs, and pours out another glass of his cousin's well-kept La Rose. "What are you going to do to find her?" asks Richard. "I've put the business in the hands of a very clever man in London, to whom my lawyers recommended me. In the abstract, I hate the idea of a private inquiry office, but in my particular case I can't get on without one. My man is to find out Sibyl's whereabouts by hook or by crook. Once found, and face to face with her, I don't think I should be long in bringing her to reason. She must have changed very much if she has ceased to love me." Dick ventures no reply to this. He has a very poor opinion of his friend's wife, thinks her stony-hearted, nay, almost inhuman, and in his idea Alexis Secretan's future happiness would be best secured by Sibyl's being kept at a distance. What could be sweeter than life in this old country house, among these fertile gardens, these park-like meadows? And why disturb the serenity of the atmosphere by bringing a woman here? The lovelier she is, the more trouble she is likely to bring. Was it not Helen's beauty which overturned a world? Mr. Secretan's new life is assuredly so full of pleasantness that if it were possible for him to forget the wife he has loved, or to cease from longing for the son he has never seen, he might reasonably take his ease and enjoy the pleasures of a tranquil mind. Cheswold seems to him just one of the most delightful places on the surface of this earth. It is set in a landscape of rural beauty, fertile, luxuriant, like a picture of Constable's. There is plenty of sport, a good pack of foxhounds in the neighbourhood to which Alexis subscribes liberally. There are pleasant neighbours, who hasten to call upon the inheritor of Cheswold Grange, and are eager to make themselves useful. Mr. Secretan finds himself received with such peculiar cordiality by fathers and mothers of goodly families of grown-up daughters, that he takes an early opportunity to let it be known that he is that worst of detrimentals, a husband without a wife. He tells one of his new friends, in the strictest confidence, that he is temporarily separated from his wife in consequence of some family quarrel, but he hopes for reunion before very long, and in a week everybody within 20 miles of Cheswold knows all about it. The disappointment is rather severe for the parents of marriageable daughters, some of whom have been hanging rather long on hand, like the winter pears on the wall. Mr. Secretan is not a great catch in the matrimonial market, of course. A pretty old house and grounds, and from 1,500 to 2,000 a year. A very moderate alliance, but a comfortable and a respectable one, think the anxious parents. And then Miss Secretan had always ranked high among her neighbours. There is an odour of sanctity about the Grange. "A pity the young fellow should have made such a mess of himself," remark the fathers. The mothers go so far as to call it a shame. The daughters feel a sense of loss, and are not quite so amiable to Mr. Secretan the next time he takes them in to dinner. Old friends whom he knew in his days of youthful extravagances find him out and rejoice in his restored fortunes. A couple of old brother officers crop up in the neighbourhood. Colonel Churton, settled and sobered into a country gentleman, great in the cultivation of mangold and turnips. Major Tollinson, who breeds prize cattle, which help to eat the colonel's roots. These are full of warmest friendliness. It seems to Alexis as if he had never been poor. He has spent some of his cousin's accumulated cash in the payment of his debts. Debts of honour and tradesmen's bills have alike been repaid, with 5% interest in every case. There is now no one living who can say he has lost money to Alexis Secretan. "What a pleasant feeling it is, Dick," says Alexis, as he pockets the last receipt, with respectful thanks. "I really feel as if I had only just reached my proper number of inches, as if I had been half a head shorter than I ought to be for the last 6 years. There is a springiness in my step, too. Ah, Dick, this is the real worth of money, the glorious privilege of being independent." Alexis has settled down comfortably in the rooms he has chosen for himself, and begins to feel as if he has lived at the Grange all his life, by the time the first frosts sparkle on the grass, and the leaves fall fast from the good old trees, and lie thick in grove and glade, despite of gardeners and wheelbarrows. He has put up new bookshelves in the library, where Miss Secretan's favourite poets and divines, in neat calf or vellum bindings, make but a small appearance, and has filled them with the books he loves, a truly cosmopolitan collection. He has bought himself a couple of clever hunters, and a useful covert hack, which he can also drive in a dog-cart. He has shot over the stubbles and in the preserves of his noble neighbour Lord Starborough, and has had 2 or 3 good runs with the foxhounds. He has made a large circle of new acquaintances, and renewed several old friendships. But in all this time he has had no tidings of Sibyl. He has, it is true, received numerous letters from the Private Inquiry Office, some promising speedy success, others asking some questions of detail which might help to confirm a suspicion or establish its falsehood, some declaring that the inquirer is on the right track. But the result has been failure. So far private inquiry has effected nothing. Despairing of ever succeeding by this means, Alexis inserts an advertisement, which he means to be his final appeal to his obdurate wife. "Dixon Street, Chelsea. I refuse to write to you through the faithful servant in L Street. I consider such indirect communication degrading to you and to me. I have no sympathy with your schemes. I decline any share in fortune so won. I claim you by my sacred right as your husband. You need not fear starvation, or even the pinch of poverty. I have obtained employment which will enable me to keep my wife and child in decent comfort. Come back and be assured of my fondest affection. Prolong our separation, and it may become eternal." This advertisement is quickly answered by another, beginning with the watchword Dixon Street. "Wait and hope. A little patience, and we shall be reunited. You cannot wish for reunion more earnestly than I do. The fabric which has taken more than 2 years to build must not be destroyed by a moment of impatience." Alexis inserts a second advertisement. "Dixon Street. Give me the custody of our son, and I will be content." To which the answer is but one word: "Impossible." On this, Mr. Secretan loses temper, and love gives way to resentment. "Heartless, inexorable," he says to himself. "She loves money better than she loves me. This sordid desire to inherit some weak-minded old woman's wealth is stronger with her than duty or affection. Is she worth all the pain I have suffered for her? Is she worthy the constancy I have given her?" The answer to these questions is a decided negative. His love for his wife has been a foolish, unreasoning passion, wasted upon an unworthy object. He now determines to forget that cold and cruel wife, and to enjoy all the pleasures of his new position. And in the various employments and engagements of country life his days glide by smoothly and pleasantly until the approach of Christmas. It is now 3 years since Sibyl left him. He dines with Colonel Churton one bright frosty evening, just a week before the Christian festival. The Colonel's spacious old house, Longley Mead, is full of guests, military and civil, young people, middle-aged people, elderly people, pretty girls with portly mothers and portlier fathers. They sit down, about 30, to dinner, in a fine oak-panelled dining-room, and the board is a merry and noisy one. Quiet flirtation is going on doubtless in some quarters, under cover of the general talk and laughter. The cross-firing of respectable old jokes, the remarkable anecdotes of horses, dogs, foxes, and birds, the discussion of that last troublesome case at Petty Sessions, and a good deal more genuine county talk. The banquet is long and splendid. But at last the ice puddings have made their round, the liqueurs have followed in fairy goblets, golden starred, the hothouse grapes have been admired, and the ladies have left the ruder sex to draw up to the host's end of the long table, and enter upon that serious discussion of the merits of various Burgundy and Bordeaux, which appears to afford so much delight to the masculine mind. "You used to be a pretty good judge of claret in your time, Secretan," says the Colonel cheerily. "Give me your candid opinion of this Margot." "About as good a judge of claret as he was of a pretty woman," says Major Tollinson, while Alexis gravely sips the Chateau Margaux. "And he had a wonderful eye for beauty." "Oh, come now," remonstrates the Colonel. "Secretan was never a lady's man. He left that kind of thing to you, Tollinson." "Oh, I grant he was too lazy a beggar to play croquet on a blazing July afternoon, or to dance attendance at picnics or tea-fights, or to make himself useful at a school feast, carrying baskets of buns and jugs of boiling tea. But he was a great admirer of the sex for all that, and at a county ball he always got the most dances with the prettiest women." "A nice clean wine," says Alexis, ignoring these remarks. "Talking of pretty women," says a young man who sits furthest from the host, "I think I had the pleasure of meeting one of the prettiest girls you could ever hope to see down in Yorkshire a week before last." The word Yorkshire catches the ear of Alexis. So large a county must needs be rich in female beauty, but he remembers that Redcastle is in Yorkshire, and thinks of Sibyl. Or perhaps it is that instinct which in some moments of our lives warns us that some word vital to our interests is about to be spoken. "Plenty of pretty women in Yorkshire," says the host incuriously. "How did you find the grouse this year, Danvers? You were staying somewhere near the moors, I suppose?" "No, I was in rather a poor country for grouse. I was at Mr. Holford's place, between Hillsborough and Redcastle." Alexis grows pale, and refills his glass with a hand that shakes a little. "May we ask for the beauty's name?" he says. "She is a Miss Faunthorpe, an heiress, I believe. At least there is a rich old East Indian party she goes about with, and I conclude she's to have his money by and by. I met her at a dinner at Sir Wilfrid Cardinal's, and the rumour is that Sir Wilfrid is going to marry her. He's uncommonly sweet upon her. That's a fact patent to the meanest comprehension." Alexis tries to check the tumultuous beating of his heart, tries to steady himself and compose his countenance, and by a great effort succeeds. "Why should this be his false wife?" asks the voice of reason. "Sibyl has a grown-up sister whom he has never seen, a sister who may be as lovely as herself, although his wife always disparaged Marian's charms. Or this Miss Faunthorpe may belong to some other family, nay, must so belong, since she is spoken of as an heiress. You have roused my warmest interest in this Yorkshire beauty," he says with assumed languor. "Could you not draw upon your powers so far as to describe her to us?" "Yes, by all means. Indulge us with a little word painting. Give us a verbal photograph of your beauty," says Colonel Churton. "Who can describe the indescribable?" exclaims Mr. Danvers, pleased at having made himself the object of general attention, after having languished in the shade during the rest of the entertainment. "Picture to yourselves. Oh, come, we want you to do the picturing. Imagine an oval face, framed with dark brown hair, loosely braided. I believe that's the word, isn't it? Hair with a glimmer of gold and a natural ripple. Eyes of darkest brown, complexion ivory pale, save when excitement flushes the cheek with a lovely pink, like the inside of those pomegranates. Features almost Grecian." "Sounds rather like a face in a fashion plate," says Major Tollinson. "I'd rather hear of a retroussé nose, red hair and freckles, or a tawny little gypsy with murderous black eyes." "Not to admire Miss Faunthorpe would be to despise perfection," says Mr. Danvers, slightly offended. "You haven't told us her Christian name," says Alexis. "It fits her to a nicety, for there is a mystic look about her pale face and dark brown eyes. Her name is Sibyl." "And she is going to be married to a Yorkshire baronet, Sir Wilfrid Cardinal, one of the wealthiest landowners in the West Riding. Mind, I don't say the match is a settled thing. It hasn't been formally announced, you know. People haven't begun to congratulate her. But the marriage is talked of. I dare say the local papers will get hold of it soon. We understand, etc." "And there is a rich uncle in question?" asks Alexis. He has recovered his self-command by this time, and makes the inquiry with the air of a man who only talks for the sake of keeping up the conversation. "Yes, a shrivelled old fellow, who eats any amount of Nepal pepper. An artful old bird. Looks as if he had made his money in slaves or opium, or something contraband. Sort of man who would have done well in Warren Hastings' time, when John Company had things all his own way in the East. Do you remember his name?" "Let me see. Travers. No. Rather an odd name. Trinder. No. Trenchard. Yes, that's it. Stephen Trenchard. Pretty niece called him sometimes Uncle Stephen, sometimes Uncle Trenchard." "Stephen Trenchard," repeats Alexis, staring blankly at the tall épergne in front of him. This is a shock he was not prepared for. Stephen Trenchard, his father's bitter enemy, the man whose arts disinherited him, Alexis, while yet unborn, the man whom his family religion taught him to execrate. And it was this man's niece, a daughter of this detested race, he had married. it was to court and cherish his father's enemy that his wife had left him. This is the fortune she is to inherit, and we are to share. This is the scheme of her life. It is for Stephen Trenchard's ill-gotten wealth I am to wait. It is for this I am to be patient and trust her. And she shows herself so true to her trust that common rumour gives her